that's most of chapter 5. Again, I'm showing you film versions that don't conflict too much with the book. There is a lot in the movie that does, so I'm being careful what I show you. But if we start with Gatsby, okay, the questions of what are his relationships like, which was your journal topic for today, and also what's his motivation or what does he want? What can you tell me about that? What can you tell me about his relationships, the types of relationships he has?
Shallow.
Kind of shallow? Yeah, what else?
He's very few of them.
He has very few of them, so he has groups that come to his house for his big parties and they don't seem to know him. And that's why you've got all these rumors going around about he was a German spy or he killed a man or you know, like that.
Transactional?
What'd you say?
Transactional?
Transactional meaning what?
That they're not personal, they're just like, oh, you want this from me? You give me this.
They're not personal, they're, I'll do this for you in exchange for something else. When he asks Nick to set him up with the tea, set up the appointment with Daisy, he comes back with, well, do this for me. Hey, by the way, you don't make a lot of money, do you? I have this side business opportunity I can pass your way. And then he very quickly follows it up with, oh, well, it's nothing illegal. It's nothing, you know, it's all above board. But Nick suspects otherwise and says, no, I'll just do it. And what I may have asked in this class before about the relationships was, if you have a friend and you do something to help them out, are you automatically expecting something in return? No. But Gatsby and his relationships with other people, they seem to work that way. Okay, and I'll show you a couple other examples of that. His motivations, what does he want?
Easy.
He wants Daisy, okay. And so tell me about his plan to get there.
He's gonna impress her, show off his stuff.
Impress her, show off his stuff. One of the concerns about the transactional relationship nature of Gatsby is, in his mind, he's got all this stuff for her. And the way he interacts with all the other people in his life, I'm hoping he doesn't interact with Daisy that way. So, okay, let's talk about symbols that you saw in this chapter, things that could be seen symbolically. What did you see?
The rain.
Huh?
The rain.
The rain?
Yeah, the rain's like.
One of the biggest examples of symbolism in literature is the weather. And you always want to pay attention to the weather, and the weather does factor into setting. So setting is time and place. If it's a spring afternoon, that's setting. But if it's raining, that's part of it. And if you noticed in the chapter, the beginning it's raining, but it's kind of a nice shower. And Daisy comes over and Gatsby's there, and then they make the comment, and the weather is mentioned a lot in this chapter. The rain, it's stopped, it's clearing, the sun's coming out, right? The heavens, the sun rays come down out of the heavens and bless their union, and it's all wonderful. But at the end of the chapter, what happens? The clouds come back in, the wind comes back in, they have to shut the doors because there's a storm coming back in again. So the weather is used symbolically. What else happened at the end when things started turning like dark, or what happened? What'd you hear, or what? Huh? Another phone call? And so what do we know about Gatsby's phone calls? We don't know who's on the other end, but they come from Chicago and Philadelphia, and sometimes at 2 in the morning. And apparently this one upset him a little bit and took his attention off Daisy. What other character is known to receive phone calls in the book? Tom. And who? When Tom gets phone calls, who have they been?
His mistress.
His mistress. So not a good thing, right? Okay, so we've got the weather, we've got the phone calls. What other symbols did you see in chapter 5?
Green light.
The green light. What's that symbolize?
Innocence. Daisy.
Daisy?
Someone's like, how much he wants her.
Okay, so It symbolizes Daisy, but not just Daisy. It's symbolic of his reaching for her. At the end of chapter 2, he's on the dock, he's got his hand held out, you know, kind of into space, and then Nick looks across the water and sees the green light over there, right? There is a passage here that I want to look at with that. There's a few. Actually, let's finish identifying the symbols and then I'll point a few things out. So we've got the green light signifying his desire for Daisy. Did you see anything else in the chapter? What did he break?
The clock.
The clock. Would that be a symbol?
Yeah, he's like, oh, like the 5 years they spent without each other.
Okay, so in another class, they said she was crying. And I said, over what? And they said, because the shirts were so beautiful. That's not really it. I mean, she didn't want to say what she was crying about. Maybe she didn't even realize for herself, but it's about the lost 5 years, right? And so you've got this idea of time, you've got this idea of 5 years, it's mentioned a couple times. And so it's a clock that Gatsby breaks. Let me back up and ask you this. So he wants Daisy, right?
Yes.
Does he know Daisy?
No.
Or he hasn't for 5 years.
He hadn't for like 5 years. So he knows the Daisy from 5 years ago. And has she changed? She's got a kid. She's married. She doesn't live in Louisville, Kentucky anymore with her parents. Like she's become an adult. Okay. And Gatsby can't be aware of all that. I mean, he's in love with this idea of the Daisy from 5 years ago. Let me ask you this. Have you ever wanted a Red Ryder BB gun for Christmas? Have you ever had something that you just really, really wanted for Christmas, birthday, or whatever, and you wanted it so bad you could almost taste it, and it's all you thought about for weeks, and then you finally got it, and then it didn't quite live up to that expectation? Or it was fun for a few days, and then it ended up in the toy box with the other toys, and it wasn't so shiny anymore, you know? Could Gatsby be setting himself up for that kind of disappointment?
Yeah,
I mean,
kinda like put her on a pedestal.
putting her big time on a pedestal, but it's not even her, it's his
The idea of her.
idealized idea of her based on what he knew 5 years ago, okay? So, any other symbols that y'all can think of from this chapter? This chapter has a lot of them. There are just a couple passages that I want to kind of talk about real quick, and then we can kind of move on. The weather, you got that, so I'm not going to point that out, but it's all over this chapter. His relationships, he's embarrassed, and when Nick says Daisy's embarrassed too, it's like he hadn't thought of that. He hadn't considered her at all. It's like he's worried about how it makes him feel. And then he, when he says, I want you and Daisy to come over to my house, is that an invitation? I mean, it is, but it's kind of a direct way of, it's not like, hey, would you like to see my house? And they're, the relationship issues, they're all over the place. But Daisy does say, I love your big house, but how do you live here all alone? And what's his answer? It's in the middle of the 90s.
Goes like random parties.
Throw random parties and
With celebrities.
I keep it always full of interesting people night and day. People who do interesting things and celebrities. He didn't say I have a lot of friends. He didn't say my friends love my parties, or I invite the people that I'm close to, or he says I keep it full of interesting people all the time. It makes me think of like the zoo, right? And it's like, the other day we went to Tractor Supply on 82nd, and I always like looking at the little baby chickens and baby ducks, and it's kind of fun. That's almost what he's I always tell my family, no, we're not buying any, we're not taking any home, but, so as far as, relationships, the way he refers to other people, and Klipspringer, who lives there, he goes and gets him a weight to play for him, to entertain him. It's almost like a servant being told what to do relationship there. He hadn't once ceased looking at Daisy, middle of 91, and I think he revalued everything in his house according to the measure of response it drew from her well-loved eyes. Sometimes, too, he stared around at his possessions in a dazed way, as though in her actual presence, none of it was any longer real. That idea that he got all this stuff for Daisy, and this passage right here, the value of his things, he's looking at his possessions and looking to see, does it please Daisy, right? That's kind of concerning for me based on the transactional nature of his other relationships. We'll see what happens. The 5 years lost makes me sad. The weather, the bottom of 92, again, it cleared, but they get back together, but then kind of a storm starts coming in again, and he says, if it wasn't for the mist, you could see your home across the bay. You always have a green light that burns all night at the end of your dock. Something else is burning too, his desire for her. But, and again, kind of creepy. He's got the scrapbook of all the pictures, and you know, it's kind of stalkerish. But all of a sudden they're together, but now there's a mist and you can't hardly see the light. Daisy put her arm through his abruptly, but he seemed absorbed in what he had just said. Possibly, and this is Nick's perspective. Nick is very kind of perceptive, I think. He's picking up on this stuff, top of 93. Possibly it had occurred to him that the colossal significance of that light had now vanished forever. And now maybe it was just a green light on a dock again. And that goes along with that idea that, was there ever a Christmas present or something you wanted so bad, and then when you finally got it, it kind of lost the magic a little bit. So somebody in the last class said it's about the chase. And yeah, I suppose that's partly it, right? Dan Cody, Gatsby's relationships again. Who's this? Picture, and he says, oh, Dan Cody, he used to be my best friend. He's dead now. And then he immediately redirects the topic and says, look at this, there's clippings of you, and shows the scrapbook, but he changes the subject from that. And it's like, okay, so he was your best friend for many years, and all you're gonna say is, he was my best friend, he's dead now, and then immediately change the subject. So that kind of shows a lack of caring, or, you know, either it was a shallow relationship, or he's not trusting Daisy enough to kind of open up, but that seems unlikely. They have Klipspringer play. Outside, the wind was loud, and there was a faint flow of thunder along the sound. All the lights were going on now. Okay, the bottom of 95. As I went over to say goodbye, I saw that the expression of bewilderment had come back into Gatsby's face. This is around the phone call time in the film. As though a faint doubt had occurred to him as to the quality of his present happiness. Almost 5 years. There must have been moments, even that afternoon, when Daisy tumbled short of his dreams, not through her own fault, but because of the colossal vitality of his illusion. He's got crazy expectations. In the movie, somebody in another class said the amount of flowers was symbolic. And it's like, yeah, symbolic of his desire for her, but symbolic as to how much he's overblown and built up this crazy expectation that a real girl probably could never live up to, right? So the war ends, they wrote, she was gonna wait for him. Armistice, the war ended in November. Gatsby didn't come home right away. She's engaged to a guy in New Orleans that spring. We don't know what happens with that, but that summer he marries Tom Buchanan. She marries Tom Buchanan, Daisy does, of Chicago. The night before, she's clutching one of those love letters and she's saying, I changed my mind, and she's upset. But, you know, there's probably a lot of pressure on her family, her friends. Tom Buchanan is super loaded, money, like, go ahead and marry him, good family, all that. So she goes through with it the next day, but if they were so in love, if she was gonna wait for him and Gatsby was gonna come back, why didn't he come back?
He was broke still.
He was broke still.
He was making money.
Yeah, he needed to come up with money, and he makes a comment in this chapter that it took him 3 years to come up with the money.
Cause he was like the war panic or whatever, or something.
Well, the following the war, the economy bounced back and a lot of people made a lot of money. We were Europe's largest creditor, rebuilding Europe, following them bombing it to pieces. But I wanna know how you make that kind of money in 3 years. It's not teaching school, right? So, when they met, Daisy's family in Louisville, they had money and they were throwing a party for officers from the Army base. Gatsby was there with other officers. He had been in college, so he's an officer. He would have been in the same uniform as everybody else in the party, so she didn't know that he didn't have money. But he knew that he wasn't gonna be able to get her without having money. Does any of this sound familiar? You remember the biography of F. Scott Fitzgerald? He goes to Princeton, not Yale, Princeton, also Ivy League. He has his heart broken by a girl. He's written a manuscript. He thinks it's enough. He'll be known as a writer, but he is suicidal following the breakup, and he decides, I'm gonna join the Army, I'm gonna go overseas in the war, and I'm not gonna come back, I'll die over there. And, okay, that's his idea. He gets stationed in Alabama. He never does go to war, because the war ends, but he meets Zelda. And Zelda, who would become his wife, she comes from a wealthy family, her dad's a judge, and he doesn't have any money. Remember, so he goes back to his parents' house in St. Paul, finishes, polishing up the manuscript into his first novel, is published, This Side of Paradise, makes him a whole bunch of money, becomes a celebrity, and then Zelda will marry. Sounds familiar. He didn't get to go to war, his characters do, Gatsby does. But you're right, that's why he didn't come back right away. Okay? Anything from this chapter or from the book so far that you're not really sure about? We've talked about Gatsby's relationships being kind of transactional, and we'll see how that plays out with Daisy. We talked about the green light, not symbolizing Daisy as much as symbolizing Gatsby's reaching and striving and desire for Daisy. But the time piece, the clock he breaks, Gatsby hasn't accepted the 5 years, the reality of the 5 years that are lost. He hasn't accepted or realized that Daisy's not the same person he remembers. And when you think back to things, it's easy to think nostalgically and remember the good. So he's thinking about the very best of Daisy. After college, I moved to Seattle and lived there for a little over 3 years. I really loved it, and when I think about that, I have great memories and it was very positive. It's easy for me to not dwell on or think about between jobs. One time there I was so poor, country crock spread and white bread was like a meal. I mean, I didn't have any money or anything. I focus on the good. And so 5 years of striving and building money and, preparing this, elaborate plan, moving across the water from Daisy, and, it's possible that his reality of Daisy his idea of her doesn't meet the reality. I mean, okay, we talked about that. Definitely the weather, it's part of setting, but the weather used symbolically is big. And then we just mentioned the phone calls. And there is a parallel there between the phone calls, and you'll see another phone call toward the end of the novel, toward the very end. But any questions? So that's chapter 5. So I call it kind of the turning point chapter, but those conflicts we know are out there, those potential problems, the affairs, people finding out, stuff like that. I mean, that hadn't happened yet, but we gotta be getting close. But all this build up to Gatsby and Daisy being back together again, well, we're there now. Here we are. But the storm clouds are rolling back in. Okay. That's it. We'll continue with chapter 6 next time. Yes, sir.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so why at the beginning of the chapter was Daisy like, do you love me, or whatever?
That's Daisy's flirty way, right? That's, because she doesn't know Gatsby's behind this invitation's tea. And not only does Nick invite her over for tea, but he says, come along. Don't bring Tom, don't bring your daughter, don't let the chauffeur come in, just get dropped off, but come along. And so that's her flirtiness. And then when she goes in the house and sees how decorated it is, you know, in the movie it's repeated, that idea, but that's all that is. And, you know, from the time that he met her in chapter 1, you know, over there, and she was lounging on the couch with Jordan Baker, I mean, if you look at her dialogue and the way she refers, is that you, my gorgeous, or, I mean, it's just kind of over the top flirty, so. Any other questions? Okay, cool. 12:38 tomorrow. Enjoy your morning off. Maybe call some friends. 92 Bakery is good for breakfast, if you've ever been there. It's in front of Walmart on 82nd Street down there, kind of across from Chick-fil-A. I recommend the kolaches there. They're like $5 and they're way better than the kolaches they call them at the donut shop next door. They're like $3.50. So if you need someplace to go with your pals, I recommend 92 Bakery. So.
Can I go get a charger and a computer from